enormously. Thank you for quite different kinds of issues. Just as an aside, this morning I was going through chapter 5 of Locke's second treatise on property, in which he says, he's using America as a model, and the idea that 1 acre of land in America, uncultivated, not accounting for hunting, is worth 1/100th of 1 acre of cultivated land in South England. He hadn't bargained for what would happen with capitalism. Okay, so I'm going to open the floor to questions. And I think the best way is to take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and then ask the speakers. Ugel isn't here, and I don't know whether Nada or I could answer for him. I think probably not. But if there are questions about that, we'll do the best we can. So, questions from the floor, please.
Of the railway system in the Middle East or in Syria and in Lebanon, it began in the 1800s. And if we look at the nature of the concessions at the time, we get to a situation today, specifically in Lebanon, where we have a disused railway network, which is kind of dormant. The stations are kind of locked. They are either squatted or abandoned and left for decay. If we would imagine adapted reuse in the future, I was wondering if you perhaps came during your research on the transfer of this property from the state that it is today to a kind of a public property, especially that in my research on the topic I've come across sayings that in the case that Lebanon would officially stop the railways, the former landowners would have the right to claim the land that was expropriated from them in the past.
First question. Thank you, Sarah. Question at the back. Railway, it's an interesting question. I mean, if you Paris, the centre of Paris, you can walk along the old railway.
Hello? I can shout. Yes. One short question to each. To Mr. Aziz, because you work on towns, it makes sense to foreground the Magella as the definition of property.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you.
Sorry. Since you work on towns, it makes sense to foreground the Magella as the definition of what we might call property, i.e. mulk. But of course, if you take the whole, the Miri is terrifically important in the 19th century transformation and in the plurality of possible conceptions of property under the late Ottomans. It's not much of a question, more a dictate. But to you, I'm very, very sympathetic, but I'm not sympathetic at the same time with foregrounding exchange over production as the starting point. And for example, but I'm very sympathetic with the effort that you're doing. And so let me just challenge you. For example, in the case that you're discussing, I think one could make a very big argument that the two bodies opposing each other, I totally accept, that idea of trying to fight over common property is a fetish, okay, that's fabulous. But if you start from production, those guys don't want to do the same things with the land, right? I mean, they're simply not engaged in exactly the same kinds of pursuits. Whereas if you only take, kind of modes of, the kind of barbarian, I don't know where Weber stands in this intellectual genealogy, okay? But Weber would be very happy to start from exchange, not production. And I think that we would lose a very great deal there. And it doesn't have to be that modes of production are exclusive. I mean, they aren't in the real historical world. Because actually the guys fighting are wanting to do different things with the land. And for social justice claims, that's terrifically important, not just starting from modes of exchange.
A third question. At the front.
I was, this is a question for David. I was very interested in your analysis, and I agree with the necessity of thinking about making how can one make a distinction between these different commons. I think that's a very interesting question. I agree also with the necessity of treating not treating the commons as an abstract concept, but grounding it in lived and empirical context. I know you were rushed, but I wasn't sure why you needed, this is a counter I suppose to the other question, why you needed your Japanese philosopher to get to where you went.
Who doesn't need a Japanese philosopher?
As opposed to any philosopher. It seems slightly ironic to go to the conceptual when you were resisting the conceptual. So maybe I missed an important point of transition.
Thank you. There's one question at the back which we'll take just.
Sorry, maybe I'm all the way up here.
So, really, again, on the Ottoman evolution, I was wondering to what extent, you seem to be largely dealing with the later stage, I mean, towards the end of the 19th century. But I was wondering to what extent, at that point you're talking very much about a kind of alliance between local notables and the central state and so on, and how this sort of plays through in the property regime. But to what extent this was the product of an earlier conflict, and how, I don't know, I mean, in a sense, how these new areas kind of gave a certain amount of space for that conflict to be settled in, perhaps. Because, I mean, yes, there's certainly this thing later in the century with, the creation of new land, as it were, or new property areas in cities. But that's something that you'd already had with, resettled areas near Aleppo, for instance, back in the mid-19th century, as I understood it. I'm not an expert. But, and how that specifically provided a kind of outlet for that conflict, if you see what I mean.
Thank you. So, you want to go?
Okay. Yes. Sorry. My question is also to David, and it's about the. I mean, it's a little bit similar to what Nick was saying, but in terms of the opposition between commons and common property and private property, there's been a bunch of scholars who have first argued that commons has been appropriated in ways that are very different from its original use. And you also make an argument that the commons that are the ones that were done by the Spaniards are very different from, say, the Native American, kinds of commons. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. But why do we need to move? So since the point that actually the commons has been already appropriated and we can actually try and recover. So I see that you're trying not to recover this kind of an original understanding of commons that's just very different from private property. But so I was wondering if you want to comment on why you are so much opposed to this project of recovering a different kind of property relations that could be possible through the commons, and you don't frame the new kind of ways of talking about commons as a kind of hijacking of the original ways of doing it.
Right.
For the most part, when we're talking about
public rights of ways, we're talking about inalienable public property. Those were not very well defined, and my paper, in a sense, needed to tackle this, but I didn't have much time to work on it, because throughout the Ottoman Empire, the effort and the emphasis was on defining the private property, and defining obligations of the private property vis-a-vis the public. Actually, in the French mandate, along with the legal framework that established the cadastral records and established the cadastral courts as independent from the religious courts, around that same time in 1927, so 1926, you had the establishment of the land registry. In 1927, the French issued the two regulations by the Higher Commissioner over the Levant. One of them establishing the public domain, and in essence, that definition then becomes part of the cadasters. And I skipped a whole part of how the cadasters were not just a question of defining the private property, but there was actually a reworking of the private property through defining the public domain. And the other one was actually on defining the private property of the state, in which the state can actually trade, buy, sell, develop, and it is alienable in that sense. So both these regulations were set up very early on in the process. In many ways, the planning process then was about, for the most part, defining new public domain areas that are inalienable, but also defining how you can transfer public domain that is inalienable to private domain. So there was that trick that was built up in the legal framework, which allowed the state subsequently to move along and privatize, as we went along, various public domain. And as we have seen, a lot of times these public domain rights then become boosted and increased by the awqaf property being incorporated into the public domain rather than being in the private realm. So in essence, the state sort of accumulates rights and then develops for itself the right to play around these things. The railways are a very funny thing because in principle and according to the law, they ought to be inalienable. And you cannot actually privatize them unless you set for yourself the legal process of transferring public domain into private state property. But what has happened is a lot of times the public domain, the eminent domain, was exercised in such a way that it developed private property for the railway. And these are different from place to place, so we cannot have a generalized way of saying all of the railways were developed in the same manner. So we cannot have a one rule. However, what has happened in many ways is that you have now some of the railway rights of ways in the public domain and some of them in the private ownership of the state. And in many ways, the ones in the private ownership can be transferred. And there's a lot of attempts by the state to transfer those in Lebanon for various reasons. But there's a part that cannot be transferred unless there's the parliamentary vote on transferring it. And that has not happened. So in many ways, that thing is going to remain in limbo for many years. The Majalla is yes, indeed, primarily a civil code. And its main application is in the urban areas. I'm not going to go into the rural Miri issue except when it comes to its implication in today's world, because most of the expansion belts around cities today are in the Miri lands. And to that extent, the implication here is very important because what's happening is that the Miri lands were sort of codified rights of use based on old taxation equity between genders and taxation obligations that sort of gets codified into long-term inalienable usurpatory rights. What has happened very often in the current planning processes from the 1960s onward is that these lands get expropriated through the power of eminent domain of the state. They get transferred into cooperatives or new developments. They get sold to the private property, but now without the original obligations of equity between the sexes or of sort of the rights and obligations that were accrued over them. So in essence, what has happened in this process is that the state have usurped those initial stipulations of equity that was there and redistributed the land now only with the very archaic inheritance law of the empire, where men inherit twice the right of women. So very interestingly, what's happening here is through very modern planning practices, we're reneging on some of the more imaginative solutions that did take place in the rural areas. Other than that, I'm not going to go into it. It's not exactly my field. With regards to the conflict between central state and elites, this is in a sense, a very long story. The story of decentralization in the Ottoman Empire is one that has not been fully developed and understood. Throughout 15th, 16th, and 17th, and into the 18th century, the whole question of decentralization was equivalent to the critical balance between secessionist movements in the remote areas of the country and the centralist tendencies. So the central state remained very, very suspicious of any attempt of empowering local elites, because there was always that temptation that the local elites would secede. So all of these sort of deals that were done in the end of the 19th century were primarily made to ensure that the local elites have enough interest and stakes in the central state, so that if the state gave them more rights over control and management in their own territories, they would not secede. So it was a pro quo in a sense of allowing people to have more rights, but linking those rights to a power issued only by the state, in which case, if they seceded, they would actually lose. And that's what, in a sense, happened as we went into the French Mandate.
First question.
Okay, so
Production.
yeah, I think I can answer all these in one answer, like Karatani would do. So that's a very good question. I think to briefly maybe give a little more background to Karatani's project, it might help because you're right. The phrase mode of production is in the very first sentence of Capital. So to say we should not pay attention to that and instead focus on mode of exchange is quite a suggestion. But let me just briefly suggest why he's doing that, and it's not necessarily, I think, why I think his framework might be useful when we're talking about property. But Karatani is interested. Mode of exchange, for him, helps us avoid the way in which mode of production has been taken up by Marxists as a kind of architectural metaphor of base and superstructure. And Karatani is... But that's unfair to Marx. No, he's not. Yeah, right. He's suggesting that this is not Marx's idea. But what he's suggesting is there's a troubling imperative that comes with the base and superstructure metaphor, and that I think he's right. There's nothing more dissatisfying than reading Lenin's State and Revolution and coming to the section on, and then the state will just wither away. So he's interested in a political project on sort of decoupling capital from the nation, from state, right? And mode of exchange helps avoid that trap, that sort of Gordian knot of nation-state capital. And I think that it's particularly useful in the case of property because, first, to get to the question, ultimately you're asking an ethical question, right? At the heart of like what this is sort of a higher best use question, and in sort of a capitalist liberal democracy, the market decides highest and best use, and so in the particular New Mexico case, their resistance is consistent within that liberal democratic argument, and therefore the market is always the highest and best use, and therefore this upscale residential development has the same ethical content, and it's a trap. And this gets to really why I'm opposed to the recovery of the commons in this particular case, and I think it's useful beyond this particular case, because it's impossible to make that particular, it's impossible to make the common property argument consistent with this sort of capitalist liberal democratic notion of property without then having thrown back in their face, well, you were the ones that dispossessed the Indians in the first place, so what claim do you have possibly to make a claim on social justice, right? So, okay, I know. Do you think I'm making the opposite argument of my book? Oh, yeah. Damn Caraton. But no, what I try to do in the book is suggest that it's much more complicated on the ground, right? I mean, the people that were launched, the poor people that were launched into these Spanish land grants were cannon fodder in a war between Spanish elites and powerful Indian nations. They're hardly the colonial agents of dispossession that that their heirs generations later are made out to be. And yet, if they don't come to terms with that violent dispossession of Indian property, then they can't possibly make claims in the present, and that will never happen as long as they allow common property, as long as common property remains a fetish, right? So we have to somehow let it be this repository of social justice in the abstract at the same time as it has this embeddedness in particular social relations. And so I think that Karatani helps do that. I think that sort of modes of exchange here helps bind this together. And it also does something even more, I think, in that it also forces us to recognize that the same sorts of modes of exchange were going on within and among Indian nations in the U.S. West, so that the Apaches and the Navajo and the Comanches and settled Pueblo Indian tribes were also negotiating with sort of reciprocity and plunder. Those sort of violent relations existed apart from Spanish land grants as well. And my argument here is that I think this particular Japanese philosopher helps us get there because of the way that modes of exchange rather than modes of production forces us to consider not just the scalar dimensions of common property that McPherson wants to direct our attentions to, but the spatiotemporal ones as well, in a way that they're prohibited from doing when they adopt a sort of liberal democratic notion of property in the sort of comparison between common and private property.
We've got just one question because time is up, I'm afraid, and we need to start again at 5 o'clock on the last session. So Aziz has a question for David.
It's actually just a reflection, because in many ways what has happened in liberal systems of governance is that you had the whole notion of commons allowed to survive as a type of property. What has happened in our part of the world is many ways the state has put itself as the representative of the commons. And to a certain extent, all forms of commons get usurped bit by bit historically in the last 150 years, and they become replaced by state custodianship. So to a certain extent, the model that you have put forward, how can we somehow use it to reverse that state imposition, because it is, in a sense, the state is the same time the judge and the plaintiff of sorts.
The state comes in and manages property as a commons. What they do is they manage the scale of access so that it just becomes commercial access, right, for resource extraction. So, but what I'm suggesting, I think that Karatani helps us do, is realize that that is at the same time coextensive. That's going on at the same time as other exchange that organize differently, right? At the same time that the state is not then purely hegemonic in a sense that there are not other reciprocal forms of exchange, or it's outside the grasp of the state, right? And so the question that Karatani wants to offer then is about that sort of the domain of that ethical domain of X is somehow managing those modes of exchange in a way that serves somehow the sort of the ethical needs of all people who have a claim, if we're talking about land or we're talking about whatever the resource is, right? So that it's not prescriptive. It's not a prescriptive idea, but it's sort of a Kantian regulative ideal and that's what Karatani's drawing, believe it or not, from Kant. So this regulative ideal, right? And it's an interesting when we talk about property, because Karatani's not talking about property, but that's precisely what property is. It's this sort of regulative idea that brings the world into that describes the world it hopes to produce. And that's precisely then about figuring out a way to turn that regulative ideal around so that property then actually does produce the world in the image we want it to. That's sort of that's his political project.
Thank you very much for the speakers and for you.